So as Matt said, I will be going over the semi-dominant mode of inheritance that was just recently specified and added to the gene curation interface. So basically the purpose of this is to allow the scoring of a gene-disease relationship that exhibit a semi-dominant mode of inheritance. For the semi-dominant, this would be disease entities in which both autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive modes of inheritance are observed and represent a continuum of disease. So you would think of it as both the autosomal dominant and recessive modes of inheritance would show the same exact phenotype with potentially differing severity. The determination of this is made according to the lumping and splitting guidelines, as well as expert guidance using these guidelines. To note, both autosomal dominant and recessive can be scored individually within this new mode of inheritance, as well as families that display semi-dominant mode of inheritance in the same gene disease record. This will include the family and individual scoring levels, and an example would be the gene LDLR with familial hypercholesterolemia. So just as an overview of some of the changes, we have an addition of the semi-dominant HPO and the mode of inheritance on our gene disease mode of inheritance modal at the start of a gene disease record. We've also included additional logic and questions to calculate the estimated LOD score. There will be guidance on entry fields to use based on the questions that are being asked to help guide that estimated LOD. Also, we have additional questions to highlight the mode of inheritance of the proband, and this is just to help alert both the curator as they're putting it in, as well as giving information back to the evidence summary of the proband's mode of inheritance. We also have inclusion of new scoring in the classification matrix, as well as inclusion of data in the evidence summary, which we'll review. So first, as I said, and as Matt had indicated, we do now have the semi-dominant mode of inheritance. It has now moved into the mode of inheritance category when you create a new gene disease record, and it has an associated HPO. So this allows the actual scoring of both the autosomal dominant, recessive, as well as semi-dominant in this record. For segregation specifically, you're going to see that there's a rearrangement of questions. Published LOD score is now at the very beginning of the family segregation, and we have included these other questions to help select on whether or not you will score the family based on its inheritance pattern. So just to go over for the published LOD score to begin with, we want to note that any family with a published LOD score, regardless of the inheritance pattern underneath this mode of inheritance, can be scored. So if you come into the GCI and you select yes, it will ask you which mode of inheritance the family displays. You will notice that all the other entry forms will be grayed out. You will no longer be able to enter information. And if you were to scroll down to the LOD score, it will ask you what the published LOD score is and whether or not you want to include it in the calculation as normal. So again, the new part being that it's been grayed out the entries for recessive and dominant, so it directs you specifically to the published LOD score. For the estimated LOD, when you have to do an estimated LOD score and you do not have a published LOD score, you can do this for autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, and semi-dominant. However, each family must meet the current requirements per the Gene Curation SOP version 6. An indication of the familial inheritance pattern is required for scoring. So again, this is where you again indicate no to the published LOD score. You will then be asked which mode of inheritance does the family display, and you will get to choose. And then we're equally going to see how some of those entry fields are highlighted or grayed out. So in the instance of autosomal dominant or X-linked only, family that displays this inheritance pattern must have 4 or more segregations to be scored. Once you indicate the autosomal dominant or X-linked, you will immediately notice that for recessive inheritance only, it is grayed out and you can no longer enter a field. Again, this directs the curator to put the entry of the applicable information for scoring into the correct field. Similarly, if you go to autosomal recessive, the family must meet at least 3 or more genotypes and affected individuals to be scored. So upon entering in autosomal recessive, you will notice again that the grayed out will be the indication of segregations that's required for autosomal dominant. You will, however, have to put in the number of affected individuals and unaffected to get an appropriate estimated LOD score. Now, for semi-dominant families, we can do an estimated LOD score, but it is going to be on either autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive in the absence of a published LOD score. So you would not be able to enter in combined information when you have a family that does display autosomal dominant and recessive in the same pedigree. And the families must meet those current specifications we just reviewed for either autosomal dominant or recessive in order to be scored. And again, the GCI will not calculate an appropriate estimated LOD score if you enter in both fields for autosomal dominant and recessive. And so we'll go through some examples of these. So in this first example of a family, we can see that this is a semi-dominant family. We have heterozygous individuals as well as homozygous individuals that are both affected. But currently, this family meets the qualifications to score for an autosomal recessive disorder. It has 6 individuals that are homozygous, that are affected, and genotype positive, whereas for the heterozygous, we only have 2 individuals, so it does not meet the 4 segregations. If we were to enter in information for this family 1 example, we would say there was not a published LOD score. They are semi-dominant and that we are going to estimate autosomal recessive. Again, I would need to put in that there are 6 individuals that are affected. There were 2 individuals that are unaffected, and it grays out the ability to add anything for the number of segregations. And this would allow for an estimation of a LOD score based on that autosomal recessive inheritance pattern that the family meets the requirements for. In the second example, we have the opposite, in which we have a semi-dominant family, but we no longer have the ability to do autosomal recessive as there are only 2 individuals that are genotype positive and phenotype positive, whereas the family does meet the 4 required segregations for autosomal dominant inheritance. So in the instance of this family, we would again say that it is a semi-dominant pedigree. However, they do meet only the autosomal dominant to estimate the LOD score, and we would put in that there are 4 segregations down here, the number of those affected individuals, and we can no longer put the number of unaffected. So again, directing the individuals in the logic to get the estimated LOD score. So I just want to also note that the GCI does alert the user to the segregation rules. If you come down to the next section of the family scoring, you will see that it will tell you you need to have 4 segregations or more for X-linked and autosomal dominant, whereas autosomal recessive requires at least 3 affected individuals. So that note still is within the GCI. Now to move on to scoring an individual. This is similar to previous scoring, again with some additional questions and logic. New logic for inclusion of scoring, where the mode of inheritance used for scoring segregations is different than the MOI for the proband. And so where this is really telling you is that for cases in which an asserted proband is autosomal recessive, but the family meets the criteria for scoring as autosomal dominant, you can still score those separate mode of inheritances but between the proband and the family. And so the GCI now includes new questions to distinguish this as well as score. The same would go for the reverse, in which you have a proband that is autosomal dominant, but the family meets recessive. And so if we come down onto this family section, I want to note this is still the family section in the GCI, but where it asks for proband information. You can still copy over the information, but the new question is asking what the proband is. And so now we can begin to distinguish exactly that the proband may have a different mode of inheritance than the family. We also have an inclusion of more variant entries in the family and the individual variant information section. That way you can incorporate any type of variants that are being asserted for that individual, for that gene-disease relationship. And also, if we continue on when entering the individual information of the proband as part of the family, the assertion of the proband's mode of inheritance is carried from the family section over to the individual when you're scoring on the individual as a note. So you will see highlighted when you come in to score that individual, it will give you the note that the proband is monoallelic and heterozygous. Again, this is just to remind the user of what the proband is when you get down to scoring the information. And when we come to scoring, we do note that now when you come in to score the information and you have the confirm the case type, you'll see that it allows both the autosomal dominant X-linked de novo as well as the autosomal recessive. And just as a note, the GCI does highlight the variants that are asserted for the proband. So this does give a second clue to the mode of inheritance and scoring. Obviously, if they're compound heterozygous, you will see the two different variants. But you can also scroll up to see what you indicated was the proband's actual mode of inheritance for your scoring. And all the same criteria for the scoring applies as it did before for an individual. If we move on to the evidence summary, you will note when you look at the evidence summary in the top that you will see the gene disease record as well as the new mode of inheritance being asserted as semi-dominant. As we move through the classification matrix, you can begin to note that both the autosomal dominant and recessive can be filled out at the same time, which are highlighted here, which would not happen before if you only picked autosomal dominant or recessive. The same logic still is included, that the maximum points for each section are included, as well as a maximum of 12 total points on genetic evidence. Furthermore, if we scroll down the evidence summary and we look at each of the case level information, we do have an overview of that information, but it also highlights what this proband is, whether they are heterozygous or homozygous. At this time, though, currently the family mode of inheritance label is not included. These updates will occur in a subsequent GCI release as we figure out some specifications of how we want that done. So in conclusion, the semi-dominant inheritance can now be scored and reviewed in the GCI. Updates to this semi-dominant scoring are in the SOP are in process and will be released soon, so you will want to check back on the website for updated notes or a new version of our SOP. In the interim, if you do have any questions, please contact the Gene Curation Small Working Group members, myself, Marina DeStefano, Jenny Goldstein, or Aaron Riggs, and we can help you work through this information.